August 1941. The clatter of Soviet T-26 tank tracks mercilessly crushes the ancient cobblestones of Tabriz, while British snipers take aim at Abadan's scorching oil derricks. Thus begins an occupation destined to become eternal. Forget the 38th parallel. What if, instead of North and South Korea, the world had received a Persia split in two, forever rewriting the bloody history of the entire Middle East and stripping us of our familiar reality? In our reality, Churchill and Roosevelt forced the Allies to withdraw. But here, Joseph Stalin issues a secret order to stay, driving an impenetrable concrete wedge bristling with machine gun nests between the north and south of the ancient empire. Imagine a world illuminated by the neon glow of propaganda minarets and bisected by colossal checkpoints along the 35th parallel. A world where two nuclear Irans hold each other in the crosshairs of ballistic missiles, awaiting a single spark. The joint British-Soviet Operation Countenance in August 1941 was planned solely as a temporary, purely tactical measure. Winston Churchill was in a panic, fearing that Abwehr agents who had infiltrated the Shah's court would hand over control of Khuzestan's invaluable oil fields to the advancing Wehrmacht divisions. The Red Army swiftly seized the northern provinces, while British motorized brigades landed in the south, securing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's facilities. Major General Vasily Novikov reported complete success to Moscow, and British Ambassador Reeder Bullard assured the local elite that the occupation would last only until Berlin's capitulation. None of these pragmatic strategists in those sweltering summer days suspected that their temporary demarcation lines would become the prologue to the 20th century's greatest geopolitical schism, transforming Iran into an arena for a relentless Cold War of attrition. The proud Reza Shah Pahlavi's abdication unfolds to the clatter of rifle bolts. On September 16, 1941, as advance units of Soviet and British troops were already entering the outskirts of Tehran, the monarch, whose iron will seemed unshakable just yesterday, with a trembling hand signed the act of abdication in favor of his young son, Mohammed. The capital immediately plunged into the paralyzing chaos of dual power. On Lalazar and Ferdowsi streets, an invisible but deadly war of intelligence agencies unfolded. NKVD agents in plain clothes recruited left-wing radicals in tea houses, while British MI6 hastily bought the loyalty of Bakhtiari tribal chiefs in the southern bazaars. Recent allies in the anti-Hitler coalition began to eye each other through rifle sights, transforming the ancient city into a seething cauldron of espionage, betrayals, and the nocturnal disappearances of undesirable politicians. At the historic Tehran Conference in late autumn 1943, the leaders of the Big Three, with broad, photogenic smiles, signed a declaration on Iran. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill solemnly, before the lenses of dozens of film cameras, promised to preserve Persia's full independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity after the global slaughter. Young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, receiving high-ranking guests in his Saadabad palace, naively believed these guarantees, sincerely thinking his country would save its statehood. However, behind the tightly closed doors of the Soviet embassy, where the main bargaining took place, the region's fate was already sealed. None of the Western diplomats suspected that the ink on the signed agreement wasn't worth a cent, and detailed plans for the Sovietization of the northern Iranian provinces, rich not only in coal but also in desperate revolutionaries, already lay in the Lubyanka safes. The true point of no return arrived in the harsh, windswept winter of 1945. While Europe celebrated victory over fascism and tallied its losses, an urgent, top-secret cipher arrived at the headquarters of the Soviet forces in Tabriz from the Kremlin. Stalin issued a categorical order: Do not withdraw the army. Consolidate positions on the northern borders at all costs, and prepare the ground for the creation of loyal buffer states. The commander of Soviet forces in Iran, General Ivan Bagramian, immediately blocked all passes in the Alborz mountain range. Soviet tanks turned their turrets south, and concrete pillboxes and barbed wire fences were hastily erected along the provisional demarcation line. What should have been a triumphant return home for the soldiers turned into the beginning of an unprecedented geopolitical siege, forever crushing the hopes of Iranians for a united, independent, and peaceful future.
Under the direct patronage of Moscow and the muzzles of Soviet machine guns, the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic was solemnly proclaimed in Tabriz. Jafar Pishevari, a devoted communist and experienced Comintern functionary whose ambitions perfectly aligned with Stalin's plans, headed the puppet government. Having gained absolute power, the new leaders immediately unleashed the flywheel of brutal Stalinist purges. Local Persian aristocracy, large landowners, and intellectuals who dared to ask questions vanished without a trace into hastily equipped basements of the local state security ministry. Ancient palaces were expropriated for the needs of the party nomenclatura, and on Tabriz's central squares, where eastern bazaars had bustled for centuries, people's militia units now marched, chanting slogans of world revolution. Northern Iran rapidly plunged into the darkness of totalitarian terror, severing itself from its historical roots and millennia-old ancestral culture.
Almost simultaneously, as if by a conductor's baton from the Kremlin, the Republic of Mahabad emerged slightly to the south. Led by the charismatic Qazi Muhammad, it transformed the smoldering Kurdish question into a powerful lever of Soviet pressure across the entire Middle East. Moscow generously supplied Kurdish militias, the Peshmerga, with brand-new Mosin rifles and artillery pieces, creating an ideal buffer shield against British influence. For Stalin, the Kurds were not just an oppressed people yearning for independence, but a perfect geopolitical master key, capable of destabilizing not only Iran itself, but also neighboring Turkey and Iraq at any moment. Mahabad became a magnet for radicals from across the Middle East, and Soviet military advisors methodically transformed disparate tribal units into a regular army fanatically devoted to the ideals of socialism. In the spring of 1946, U.S. President Harry Truman, realizing the scale of the impending catastrophe, issued a harsh ultimatum to Moscow, threatening the use of nuclear weapons if the Red Army did not leave Iranian territory. In our reality, this worked. But in this timeline, Washington's ultimatum shatters against the steel will of Soviet tank divisions, firmly entrenched along the 35th parallel. Stalin, bluffing with the icy calm of a poker player, declared that Soviet troops were in the north at the direct request of the legitimate governments in Tabriz and Mahabad. The world froze on the brink of World War III. American bombers warmed their engines at bases in Europe, but Truman blinked first at the last moment, unwilling to trade post-war peace for the salvation of a distant Asian monarchy. The Rubicon was definitively crossed. In London, genuine panic erupted. Realizing that the North was forever lost, Whitehall issued an urgent order for British expeditionary forces to immediately dig in the South. The oil-rich province of Khuzestan, the country's beating industrial heart, was swiftly transformed into an impregnable military fortress. British engineers erected multi-kilometer lines of trenches and minefields around the Abadan oil refinery, guarding the assets of the Anglo-Iranian oil company like the apple of their eye. Prime Minister Clement Attlee cynically decided to sacrifice the northern territories to maintain control over southern oil, vital for rebuilding the devastated British economy. Southern Iran effectively became a colonial protectorate of the crown, where every political decision of the Shah now had to be endorsed by the signature of a British resident, and local generals received orders directly from London. Illusions finally shattered when the 1943 Tehran agreements were publicly torn up and discarded into the dustbin of history. Faced with a stalemate, the exhausted great powers decided to legalize the status quo. At a tense conference in Geneva, to the accompaniment of mutual accusations and the bang of gavels, stone-faced diplomats reluctantly formalized the division of Iran along the 35th parallel. The map of ancient Persia was mercilessly sliced with a red pencil like a festive cake. The north was officially recognized as a zone of Soviet interests, while the south remained under the protectorate of the Anglo-American bloc. No one asked the opinion of the Iranians themselves. Politicians in expensive suits simply drew a straight line through mountains, deserts, and living cities, signing a death warrant for a unified nation and laying the foundation for the longest and bloodiest conflict in the Middle East.
A real, physically tangible iron curtain grinds down upon the Middle East. The 35th parallel instantly becomes overgrown with thousands of kilometers of barbed wire, watchtowers with searchlights, and control strips. This artificial border mercilessly bisects millennia-old villages where neighbors suddenly find themselves citizens of warring states. It divides ancient families, forever separating mothers from sons, and completely blocks historical caravan routes along which silk and spices flowed for centuries. Shepherds who accidentally cross the invisible line in search of pastures receive a sniper's bullet without warning. What began as a temporary military demarcation transforms into a bleeding wound on the body of Asia. The Iranian Wall becomes a symbol of a new era where human destinies are ground down by the soulless millstones of geopolitical confrontation between two superpowers.
Tehran, finding itself dangerously close to the new border, loses its status as capital. Realizing that the city's northern quarters were within range of Soviet howitzers, the Shah's government made an emergency decision to relocate the political center of southern Iran. The choice fell upon ancient, majestic Isfahan, situated deep in the rear, surrounded by insurmountable mountains and deserts. Caravans of trucks laden with gold reserves, government archives, and antiques from the Golestan Palace hastily left Tehran under the cover of night. Isfahan, the city of turquoise domes and poets, rapidly transformed into a militarized bureaucratic citadel. Here, far from the front line, amidst the ancient mosques of Nakhchivan Square, concrete bunkers for ministries and headquarters for Western intelligence agencies were hastily erected, turning the architectural jewel of the East into a nerve center of global confrontation. In the turbulent 50s, southern Iran, under the rule of the young and ambitious Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, underwent a radical transformation. Realizing that the British Empire was crumbling, the Shah made a strategic bet on Washington. The country rapidly became a hyper-militarized outpost of the United States in the Middle East. The Pentagon literally flooded Isfahan with billions of dollars in financial aid and the latest weaponry. Giant air bases housing American strategic bombers aimed at Soviet Baku sprang up in the deserts. The Iranian army donned NATO-style uniforms and trained under the guidance of tough Texas Rangers. The South became a glittering showcase of capitalism, where traditional Islamic ways were aggressively displaced by Hollywood culture, Cadillacs, and neon casino signs, causing simmering resentment among the conservative clergy. Meanwhile, in the north, the People's Democratic Republic of Iran was formed from the fragments of occupied provinces. The two-day Communist Party, having completely purged the political landscape of rivals, established a brutal totalitarian regime, tailored after Stalinist Moscow and early Pyongyang. A ruthless fanatic became the general secretary, whose portraits were now mandatory in every home from Tabriz to Mashhad. Religion was declared the opium of the people. Ancient mosques were converted into ammunition depots and museums of atheism,
while dissenting mullahs were sent to labor camps lost in the icy gorges of the Alborz. Northern Iran hermetically sealed itself off from the outside world. Society was permeated by paranoia. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children disowned parents, and state radio broadcast around the clock about an imminent attack by imperialists from the south.
In 1951, a political crisis erupted in the south. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, driven by patriotism, attempted to nationalize the oil industry, challenging the British monopoly. In our reality, this led to a long struggle. But in the world of two Irans, his fate was decided in a matter of hours. British intelligence masterfully played the red card. MI6 fabricated convincing evidence that Mossadegh was allegedly a secret agent of the Tudeh Party and was preparing to open the southern borders to Soviet tanks. The threat of a communist invasion acted like a red flag to a bull in Washington. Mossadegh's political career was instantly destroyed. Under pressure from the CIA and London bankers, the Shah sent the defiant prime minister into lifelong exile, and Khuzestan's oil derricks remained under the firm control of Western corporations.
The famous Operation Ajax to overthrow the government was simply not needed in this reality. The CIA and MI6, panicking at the slightest destabilization in the border state, voluntarily granted Shah Pahlavi absolute, unlimited dictatorial powers. Any talk of a constitutional monarchy or parliament was declared aiding the enemy. For the sake of rock-solid stability on the southern borders, the West turned a blind eye to the suppression of free speech and opposition. The Shah became a full-fledged autocrat whose word was law, and the slightest dissent was equated with treason. Washington cynically reasoned, better a cruel tyrant rule in Isfahan than democratic chaos, which saboteurs from the north would immediately exploit. Southern Iran became a gilded cage, where economic prosperity was bought at the cost of a complete surrender of civil liberties. To maintain this absolute power, with direct technical support from the CIA and Israeli Mossad, SAVAK was created, Asia's most ruthless and technologically advanced intelligence agency. Its agents, dressed in expensive Italian suits, became a nightmare for any citizen of southern Iran. SAVAK didn't just suppress internal dissent, they waged a continuous, invisible, and bloody secret war against northern saboteurs right in the dark alleys of Isfahan and the port docks of Bandar Abbas. Shootouts with silenced weapons, daylight abductions, interrogations using psychotropic substances, and brutal torture in secret prisons became routine. The intelligence agency infiltrated every pore of society, creating an atmosphere of total fear where even a whisper in the kitchen could turn into a one-way ticket.
Meanwhile, in the north, behind the concrete curtain, a completely different, ruthless transformation unfolded. The economy of the People's Democratic Republic of Iran underwent forced, bloody industrialization, according to Stalinist blueprints. The bustling, saffron and cardamom-scented eastern bazaars of Tabriz and Rasht were mercilessly bulldozed. In their place rose cyclopean steel mills, spewing black smoke into the once clean sky, and deep coal mines where thousands of political prisoners toiled to exhaustion. The Tudeh Party methodically uprooted a millennia-old way of life, herding peasants into agricultural communes. Soviet engineers erected colossal hydroelectric power plants on the Rs River, providing energy to military factories churning out Kalashnikov rifles by the thousands. This new, smoke-blackened northern Iran no longer had anything in common with the romance of Persian fairy tales. It was now a harsh, clanking industrial monster preparing for an inevitable war.
In response to the North's industrial surge, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched his famous White Revolution in the South, but here it was accelerated tenfold. Washington poured astronomical sums of unprecedented grants into the economies of Isfahan and Shiraz, aiming to create a glittering showcase of capitalism on the very edge of the Soviet abyss.
American corporations built trans-Iranian highways, modern hospitals, and luxurious hotels, flooding the country with concrete and dollars. Agrarian reform was carried out harshly and swiftly. Lands were seized from rebellious feudal lords and transferred to loyal farmers equipped with the latest John Deere tractors. The Shah wanted to demonstrate to the entire Middle East the absolute superiority of the free market over the dreary planned economy of its neighbor. Southern Iran rapidly westernized. Women shed their chadors for Parisian-style miniskirts, and Cadillacs and neon signs for cinemas showing Hollywood blockbusters appeared on the streets.
But nowhere was this chasm between two worlds felt as acutely as in Tehran. The ancient capital replicated Berlin's tragic fate, finding itself bisected by a ruthless front line. Directly through the historic center, along Valieser Street, ran a colossal concrete wall, bristling with electrified barbed wire and machine gun towers. Northern Tehran plunged into the gloom of rationed food and curfews, while southern Tehran glittered with the lights of casinos and expensive restaurants. Every day, desperate defectors attempted to cross this death strip. They dug tunnels beneath the ruins of Golestan Palace, tried to fly over the wall on homemade hang gliders, or simply ran through minefields under the cover of night. Most met their deaths from SAVAK snipers' bullets or two-day border guards, forever lying in the no-man's land.
Tension between the two Irans extended far beyond the Earth's atmosphere when the Middle Eastern space race began in the late 50s. Northern Iran, with direct technical support from Moscow, delivered the first stunning blow. From the top-secret Semnan II Cosmodrome, literally carved out by slave labor directly into the impregnable rocks of the Alborz mountain range, a modified R-7 rocket launched into the night sky. It carried the first Iranian satellite, Red Star of Persia, into orbit, its radio signal from space becoming a resounding slap in the face to the entire Western world. This triumph of communist engineering caused undisguised panic in Washington and Isfahan. If the North could launch a satellite, then their ballistic missiles could easily reach the oil terminals of the Persian Gulf. The status quo was broken, and the South was compelled to respond with a strike of unprecedented power.
Southern Iran's response proved far more ominous. Under the strictest secrecy, relying on the financial might from oil sales and technological support from Paris and Washington, the Shah launched a colossal nuclear program. In the lifeless sands of the Dashti Lut Desert, hidden from Soviet reconnaissance planes by mirages and sandstorms, cyclopean domes of heavy water reactors began to rise. French engineers and American physicists worked side by side with the elite of southern Iranian science, creating the infrastructure for uranium enrichment. Officially, this was presented as peaceful atomic energy for the growing economy. But in secret bunkers beneath Isfahan, SAVAK generals were already drawing up plans for the use of tactical nuclear warheads against the North's tank wedges. The Middle East took its first step toward the edge of a nuclear abyss from which there would be no return.
Direct confrontation was too dangerous, so the two Irans tore the region apart through brutal proxy wars. Northern Iran, pumped full of Soviet weapons and ideological fanaticism, began to generously sponsor Marxist guerrillas across the Arabian Peninsula. Oman became the epicenter, where Dhofar rebels, armed with northern automatic rifles and trained in camps near Tabriz, launched a bloody insurgency against the Sultan. The Arabian Peninsula transformed into a veritable powder keg. Southern Iran, acting as America's attack dog, dispatched its special forces and helicopter squadrons to suppress the communist uprising. Fierce battles unfolded in Oman's sun-scorched mountains, where Southerners, supported by British mercenaries, methodically incinerated rebel hideouts with napalm. This hidden war claimed thousands of lives, but only fueled the hatred between Isfahan and Tabriz.
On the northwestern borders, the situation was even more catastrophic. A unified Soviet Kurdistan, created by Moscow as a buffer zone, became a constant nightmare for neighboring Turkey and Iraq. Having gained autonomy and inexhaustible stockpiles of Soviet weaponry, Kurdish formations began actively supporting their brethren across the border. Endless, exhausting border skirmishes, sabotage on oil pipelines, and shelling of Turkish outposts occurred. Ankara and Baghdad furiously massed troops at their borders, but dared not cross the line, fearing direct confrontation with the Soviet tank armadas standing behind the Kurds. This artificially created geopolitical festering wound constantly bled, turning the entire region into a zone of permanent instability and forcing NATO to keep its bases in Turkey on round-the-clock alert.
Southern Iran hit the real jackpot during the 1973 oil crisis. When Arab countries declared an embargo on the West, attempting to strangle the economies of the US and Europe, Shah Mohammad Reza made a cynical but brilliant decision. He categorically refused to join the boycott. Southern Iran became the primary, virtually unrivaled supplier of black gold to the entire Western world. Tankers departed from Karg Island terminals around the clock, and a veritable golden shower poured into Isfahan's treasury. Within months, the country became fabulously wealthy. The Shah acquired the latest F-14 Tomcat fighters, built colossal military bases, and transformed his army into the most technologically advanced force in the Middle East. This oil triumph definitively cemented the alliance between Isfahan and Washington, making southern Iran an untouchable bastion of capitalism.
It was these petrodollars and SAVAK's total control that forever changed the course of world history. The 1979 Islamic Revolution, which shook our reality, is simply canceled here. There are no multi-million-strong crowds in the streets demanding the overthrow of the monarchy. Any nascent radical Islamism is brutally and preemptively eradicated by security agents. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini himself, barely beginning his sermons against the Shah, vanishes without a trace into the damp dungeons of Evan's secret prison. His followers are either liquidated or intimidated into silence. The West breathes a sigh of relief. Religious radicalism is stifled in its infancy. No American embassy takeover, no hostage crisis. Instead, in 1979, the Shah pompously celebrates another anniversary of the Pahlavi dynasty, reviewing a parade of the latest American tanks in Isfahan Square to the applause of Western ambassadors.
As a result of this schism, the Islamic clergy suffered a crushing historical defeat on both sides of the 35th parallel. In the South, mullahs completely lost political influence, becoming a decorative appendage to the secular monarchy. Mosques were strictly controlled, and sermons were dictated by SAVAK officers. In the North, the situation was truly catastrophic. The Two-Day Party, adhering to the dogmas of Marxism-Leninism, brutally eradicated religion with state atheism. Ancient mosques in Tabriz and Mashhad were converted into ammunition depots and museums of scientific atheism. Clergymen were declared enemies of the people, sent to labor camps or shot in counterintelligence basements. Persia's millennia-old Islamic tradition found itself caught in a vice between the aggressive capitalist consumerism of the South and the ruthless totalitarian atheism of the North, rapidly losing its sway over people's minds.
Decades of accumulated hatred and arsenals could not rust in warehouses forever. In the early 80s, the Middle East exploded into a bloody Iran-Iran war. This monstrous conflict replaced the protracted war with Iraq in this reality, but surpassed it in scale and brutality. Triggered by a border incident in divided Tehran, the war instantly escalated into a total war of attrition. The North launched endless waves of infantry, supported by thousands of Soviet T-72 tanks, attempting to breach the South's defenses and seize the oil fields of Khuzestan. The South responded with massive carpet bombings using American aircraft. The sky over ancient Persia darkened with the smoke of burning oil wells and bomber squadrons. Brother fought brother, and the front line, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, became a meat grinder of the industrial age. The Zagros Mountains became the arena for a surreal Dieselpunk slaughter, where the technologies of two superpowers clashed. Due to the complex terrain, classic tactics failed. Northerners used giant Soviet walking excavators, hastily converted into mobile artillery pillboxes, which slowly crawled through mountain passes, spewing fire from large-caliber guns. In response, the South launched its elite F-14 Tomcat fighter squadrons, armed with Phoenix missiles. American planes dived on the North's clumsy steel monsters, turning the gorges into graveyards of twisted, smoking metal. In narrow valleys, brutal bayonet charges unfolded, where soldiers in Soviet helmets with red stars engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the Shah's guards, clad in NATO-standard Kevlar body armor. This was a war of contrasts, where archaic brutality was multiplied by advanced technologies of destruction. When the Blitzkrieg failed and the front line froze in a positional stalemate, both sides crossed the last moral boundary. The massive, barbaric use of chemical weapons began. The North's artillery rained sarin shells on southern positions, causing agonizing death to entire battalions in their trenches. The South, without hesitation, responded with carpet bombings using mustard gas and Agent Orange, attempting to incinerate partisan bases in the forests bordering the Caspian Sea. Flourishing border valleys, once famous for their pomegranate orchards, were transformed within months into lifeless, toxic wastelands. Yellow, poisonous fog spread across the land, contaminating rivers and groundwater for decades to come. Photographs of children disfigured by chemical burns appeared in global newspapers, causing shock, but the superpowers merely cynically blocked UN resolutions. By 1988, both economies were exhausted to their limits and human reserves depleted. Through UN mediation, a difficult, grinding ceasefire was signed in Geneva. This treaty did not bring peace. It merely solidified the bloody status quo. The borders of the two Irans remained virtually unchanged, shifting only a few kilometers in the scorched mountains. But the price of this negligible shift was horrific. The land along the 35th parallel was literally soaked with the blood of nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians. No one celebrated victory. In Isfahan and Tabriz, mothers mourned entire generations of young men lost in the trenches. The war left behind unresolved contradictions, millions of disabled, and kilometers of minefields, guaranteeing that this conflict was merely a rehearsal for the coming apocalypse. The shock of the war was followed by a geopolitical earthquake. In 1991, the Soviet Union rapidly collapsed. For northern Iran, this became a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Overnight, supplies of cheap oil, factory spare parts, and financial subsidies from Moscow ceased. The North's economy plunged into an abyss, store shelves emptied, and factories ground to a halt. Western analysts predicted the inevitable fall of the regime and a swift reunification of the country, following the German scenario. But the local Politburo in Tabriz categorically refused to surrender power. Surrounded by enemies, deprived of their patron, the leaders of the North chose a path of total isolation. They sealed their borders, declared a state of emergency, and deployed the army to suppress any hunger riots. Northern Iran transformed into a besieged fortress, ready to burn to ashes rather than capitulate to the south. Left alone, the North spawned its own twisted ideology of survival, a Middle Eastern equivalent of Juche. It was a bizarre, frightening blend of radical Marxism, militarism, and ancient Persian nationalism. Party ideologues rewrote history. Now they were not merely builders of communism, but the true heirs of the Achaemenid Empire, besieged by decadent Western barbarians. Portraits of Marx and Lenin in Tabriz squares stood alongside gigantic bas-reliefs of King Darius and Cyrus the Great, rendered in the style of socialist realism. From infancy, citizens were indoctrinated that they were a chosen people, whose sacred mission was to withstand the ring of enemies and one day cleanse the defiled South with fire and sword. This ideological mutation cemented society, transforming fear and hunger into fuel for fanatical devotion to the state.
In the wake of this crisis, a new, young, and utterly ruthless dictator rose to power in the north. He swiftly purged the old party guard, conducting public executions directly in stadiums. His methods of cementing power were built on absolute, paralyzing terror and the creation of a personality cult that eclipsed the glory of ancient pharaohs. Every morning in schools began with an oath of allegiance to the supreme leader, and his bronze statues towered over every intersection, grimly gazing upon the impoverished but impeccably clean streets. The North's special services implemented a system of collective responsibility. For the escape of one person, his entire family, down to the third generation, was sent to labor camps. In this atmosphere of total paranoia, any dissent became physically impossible, and northern Iran transformed into a perfect, hermetically sealed machine of dictatorship.
Meanwhile, southern Iran in the 90s presented a striking contrast. It was a glittering, neon-drenched, yet internally decaying capitalist utopia. Oil's super profits created a colossal gap between a handful of ultra-rich aristocrats close to the Shah and millions of impoverished people. The elite flew to Nice for weekends, bought penthouses in London, and hosted decadent parties in palaces on the Persian Gulf Coast, washing down black caviar with vintage champagne. But beyond the guarded elite quarters stretched endless slums, where oil field workers huddled in shacks without sanitation. Corruption permeated all layers of the state apparatus, and the economy was critically dependent on Western corporations. Southern Iran appeared as a showcase of prosperity, but the foundation of this glittering palace was inexorably covered with deep social cracks.
The capital of the South, Isfahan, definitively acquired the features of a grim cyberpunk megalopolis. Ancient minarets and turquoise mosque domes were lost in the shadow of cyclopean glass skyscrapers belonging to transnational corporations. The night sky was cut by searchlight beams and gigantic, tens of meters high holograms of the aging Shah broadcasting about stability and economic growth. The streets were bathed in the light of neon advertisements for American brands and Japanese electronics. SAVAK police drones buzzed through the air, scanning the faces of passers-by in search of undesirable elements. In expensive clubs, the golden youth consumed synthetic drugs to deafening electronic beats, while on the lower levels of the city, a black market for cybernetic implants and smuggled weapons flourished. This was a city of triumphant hypercapitalism, where absolutely everything was for sale, except freedom of speech.
It was in these dark, government-forgotten slums of the South that a powerful underground resistance began to mature. Hatred for the corrupt monarchy and SAVAK's brutality forged an unthinkable alliance. Marxist intellectuals, who miraculously survived the dungeons, united with radical Islamists who had been driven underground for years. In the damp basements of Isfahan and Shiraz, they printed leaflets, assembled homemade explosive devices, and planned targeted assassinations of state security officers. This resistance had nothing to do with the romance of revolution. It was a desperate, brutal urban guerrilla warfare against the superior forces of a police state. The monarchy responded with mass raids and public executions of rebels in the squares, but the hydra of rebellion only grew new heads. The internal cauldron of southern Iran began to boil, threatening to explode the glittering capitalist facade from within. While the South battled its internal demons,
Northern Iran masterfully exploited the geopolitical collapse of its main patron, the Soviet Union. In the early 90s, as the once mighty Soviet Empire crumbled to dust, agents of Tabriz's secret service flocked to closed scientific towns like Sarov and Snezhinsk. For suitcases of cash dollars and promises of a paradisiacal life, they recruited impoverished, desperate Soviet nuclear physicists whose salaries had turned to dust due to hyperinflation. These brilliant minds, who had created the USSR's nuclear shield, were now secretly transported across the Caspian Sea on inconspicuous dry cargo ships. In secret underground laboratories, carved into the granite depths of the Alborz mountain range, feverish work began. The dictator of the North demanded an absolute weapon of retribution, capable of wiping the hated capitalists of the South off the face of the earth once and for all. Thus, the poverty of the post-Soviet space became the catalyst for creating the most terrifying atomic program in the entire Middle East. Doomsday for the region arrived on September 9, 1998. At 5:30 a.m., seismic stations from Washington to Tokyo registered an anomalous tremor of magnitude 5.8. The epicenter was not a tectonic fault, but deep beneath the lifeless salt flats of the Dashti Kavir Desert in northern Iran. Several hours later, a Tabriz radio announcer, his voice trembling with exultation, announced the successful test of the Democratic Shield, the first nuclear device with a yield of 20 kilotons. This underground explosion caused a genuine tectonic shock in the offices of world leaders. The CIA was furious at its own failure, and the Pentagon hastily rewrote World War III scenarios. The South's monopoly on technological superiority vanished in radioactive dust. Northern Iran, from a marginal rogue state, instantly transformed into a nuclear power, capable of dictating its terms to the entire Middle East, holding millions of lives hostage on the other side of the 35th parallel.
Isfahan's reaction to its neighbor's nuclear démarche was not long in coming. By personal order of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Jr., southern Iran demonstratively brought its strategic forces to full combat readiness. Live on national television, cyclopean underground silos in the Zagros mountains were shown, their multi-ton armored doors slowly parting to reveal the predatory noses of Shahab-6 ballistic missiles with American MIRV warheads. Their range allowed them to incinerate Tabriz in a matter of minutes. From this moment, a blood-chilling regime of mutually assured destruction was established in the Middle East, an exact replica of the American-Soviet confrontation during the Cold War. Any border skirmish, any downed drone, or careless statement by politicians could now trigger a chain reaction that would transform Persia's flourishing oases into a lifeless radioactive wasteland of molten glass and ash.
The escalation of the conflict instantly transformed the Persian Gulf into the most militarized body of water on the planet. Washington, panicking at the thought of losing control over southern Iranian oil, made an unprecedented decision. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet moved its main operational base directly to Bandar Abbas, turning Iran's southern coast into an impregnable maritime fortress. Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carriers now patrolled the Strait of Hormuz around the clock, and Aegis-equipped destroyers targeted the airspace over the entire region. The Gulf waters literally teemed with attack submarines, ready at the first command to unleash a swarm of Tomahawk cruise missiles on northern industrial centers. Merchant tankers moved exclusively in massive convoys under the cover of attack helicopters. The global economy found itself hostage to this powder keg. The slightest spark in the Gulf waters would mean an instant explosion in oil prices and a global financial collapse. While politicians rattled nuclear sabers, a quiet but monstrous ecological catastrophe unfolded in the north, slowly killing the Caspian Sea. The forced industrialization of northern Iran and the construction of cyclopean giant factories proceeded without the slightest regard for nature. Thousands of tons of heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and untreated industrial effluents were dumped daily into the rivers feeding the unique reservoir. But the most terrible blow came from the radioactive waste of the secret nuclear program, which Northern engineers cynically submerged directly into the coastal waters. The once crystal-clear sea became covered with an oily film and dead fish. The population of the famous sturgeon was virtually annihilated, and an epidemic of oncological diseases swept the northern coastal cities. The Caspian turned into a gigantic toxic cesspool, vividly demonstrating how a ruthless arms race and a fanatical lust for power can destroy life itself on ancient Persian soil.
The 2000s arrived, but in this reality, the notorious global war on terror never became the main agenda for the international community. The events of September 11th simply did not happen, as radical Islamism had been stifled in its infancy. Instead of hunting bearded fanatics in Afghan caves, the eyes of strategists in the Pentagon and Langley were firmly fixed on the 35th parallel. The threat of local terrorist attacks paled before the real prospect of a full-blown nuclear Armageddon between Tabriz and Isfahan. The UN Security Council convened emergency meetings almost every month, trying to prevent another escalation. Diplomats worked tirelessly, establishing hotlines between the two capitals to rule out accidental missile launches due to early warning system failures. The world balanced on the thinnest tightrope over an abyss, understanding that humanity's fate was being decided not in Washington or Moscow, but on the scorching sands of divided Persia.
In the shadow of this titanic confrontation, neighboring Iraq experienced its golden age of stability. Saddam Hussein, having avoided overthrow, successfully ruled the country, becoming an indispensable geopolitical player. Baghdad masterfully balanced on a knife's edge between the two Irans. For the CIA, Saddam became a crucial ally, a watchdog curbing communist Tabriz's ambitions on the western flank. Washington generously flooded Iraq with billions of dollars in military aid and the latest weaponry, turning a blind eye to any human rights violations. At the same time, the Iraqi dictator managed to conduct secret trade with northern Iran, selling them smuggled oil in exchange for Soviet tank spare parts. Baghdad transformed into the world's spy capital, a Middle Eastern Casablanca, where in expensive restaurants, agents from Mossad, the CIA, and the northern MGB struck shadowy deals, deciding the fates of entire nations over a cup of strong Arabic coffee.
The threat from the north spawned another alliance unthinkable in our reality. Israel and southern Iran formed an ironclad, unbreakable strategic alliance. The common enemy, in the form of totalitarian, nuclear-armed Tabriz, erased all religious and cultural contradictions. An invisible bridge was laid between Tel Aviv and Isfahan, across which secret data flowed continuously. Mossad and SAVAK conducted joint, daring operations to eliminate northern nuclear physicists in Europe. But most importantly, Israel transferred advanced missile defense technologies to the Southerners. An impenetrable wall of iron dome complexes and aero missile defense systems, adapted to the specifics of the Persian landscape, rose around southern Iranian megacities. Israeli engineers, side by side with their Iranian counterparts, stood guard around the clock in underground command posts, scanning radars. This pragmatic alliance of the region's two most powerful armies became the main nightmare for northern generals, nullifying their missile advantage. When the first timid sparks of discontent swept across the Middle East in the early 2010s, the Arab Spring choked in its own blood, barely having begun. In this reality, the great powers could not afford the luxury of democratic experiments. Any rebellion, any attempt to overthrow established regimes in Egypt, Syria, or Libya was seen as a direct threat to the fragile balance of power around divided Iran. Washington,
Beijing and Moscow acted with frightening unanimity. Uprisings were crushed by tank treads with the full silent consent of the international community. Dictators were given carte blanche to use any suppression methods, including carpet bombing their own cities. Stability for the sake of deterring nuclear apocalypse became the absolute priority. The Middle East was frozen in a state of permanent, brutal autocracy, where the slightest hint of freedom was scorched with napalm in the name of preserving the global status quo.
Understanding that direct military confrontation offered equal chances, northern Iran bet on the invisible front. In deep bunkers beneath Tabriz, an elite cyber warfare unit was created, the Northern Unit 8200. Thousands of brilliant programmers, raised in strict isolation and fanatical devotion to the regime, tirelessly sought vulnerabilities in the South's digital infrastructure. They became the most dangerous hackers on the planet, capable of paralyzing life on the other side of the wall with a single keystroke. Their attacks were elegant and destructive. They hacked traffic control systems in Isfahan, causing transportation collapse, seized control of pumping stations, leaving entire districts without water, and orchestrated massive blackouts, plunging glittering neon megalopolises into darkness. This permanent digital war exhausted southern Iran no less than the threat of a nuclear strike, proving that in the 21st century, code could be more lethal than a ballistic missile.
The 35th parallel itself, once a mere line on a map, had over decades transformed into the most terrifying frontier on Earth. A demilitarized zone several kilometers wide, untouched by human foot for decades, had become overgrown with dense, impenetrable wilderness. But this rampant nature concealed death. Millions of anti-personnel mines lay hidden beneath the foliage and bushes, creating a solid carpet of explosives. Motion sensors and thermal imagers were camouflaged in the trees, and every 100 meters, concrete towers with automated machine gun turrets controlled by soulless artificial intelligence stood tall. Any living creature larger than a fox that crossed the invisible line was immediately riddled with bullets. This exclusion zone, cutting through ancient Persia from the Iraqi border to the Afghan mountains, became a chilling monument to human paranoia. A dead zone where nature exacted its revenge, feeding on the blood of careless trespassers.
However, no walls or minefields could stop human greed. Along the deadly border, a phenomenal black market, unimaginable in its scale, flourished. Desperate smugglers, risking being torn to shreds or shot by border guards from both sides, forged secret paths through the minefields. From south to north flowed a continuous stream of scarce Western microchips, vital for modernizing northern missiles, prohibited medicines, and Hollywood movies on flash drives. In the opposite direction, hidden beneath the chassis of rusty trucks, came the famous Caspian black caviar, artisanally mined gold, and, most terrifyingly, capsules of weapon-grade plutonium stolen from military depots. This bloody trade enriched corrupt generals on both sides of the wall, who turned a blind eye to gaps in defenses, transforming ideological confrontation into a cynical and deadly business. Over decades of isolation, the cultural chasm between the two parts of a once unified people became truly astronomical. Southern Iran lived to the rhythm of a globalized world. In Shiraz nightclubs, the golden youth danced until dawn to the pulsating beats of Persian synth pop, watched premieres of Hollywood blockbusters, and discussed the latest Western fashion trends on social media banned in the North. At the same time, in the North, the state machine churned out grim, colorless films about the labor feats of miners and the heroic struggle against capitalist spies. Tabriz television broadcast endless military parades and speeches by the great leader. Language, traditions, even culinary preferences, everything underwent a brutal mutation. Southerners viewed Northerners as zombified fanatics from the last century, while Northerners genuinely despised Southerners,
considering them corrupted puppets of American imperialism who had lost their true Persian soul.
Despite total propaganda, the humanitarian crisis along the 35th parallel never subsided. Desperate citizens of northern Iran, fleeing hunger, repression, and hopelessness, regularly made suicidal attempts to escape to the capitalist paradise of the south. At night, armed only with homemade wire cutters and blind hope, they tried to overcome the multi-layered system of barriers. Most met their deaths within the first few minutes. The bodies of fugitives, torn apart by tripwires or riddled with bullets from autonomous patrol robots, hung for weeks on the barbed wire, serving as a grim warning to others. Southern border guards, observing this slaughter through thermal imagers, were strictly instructed not to intervene to avoid provoking an international conflict. Each such death, broadcast live, became a tiny tragedy of a divided nation, mercilessly ground by the millstones of grand geopolitics.
With the dawn of the 21st century, the political landscape shuddered once more. The collapsed Soviet Union was replaced by a new, far more powerful patron. Rapidly growing China saw northern Iran as an ideal springboard for expansion into the Middle East. Beijing acted pragmatically and ruthlessly. In exchange for access to rich uranium and copper deposits, the Celestial Empire became Tabriz's economic savior and absolute suzerain. Chinese investments poured into the north like a wide river, resuscitating semi-dead industries. Thousands of engineers from Shanghai and Shenzhen modernized power grids and implemented systems of total digital control over the population, surpassing even Orwell's fantasies. Northern Iran effectively transformed into a giant resource colony of China, reliably protected by a nuclear umbrella. This deal with the devil allowed the regime to survive, but definitively stripped it of its remaining sovereignty, turning the dictator into an obedient puppet of the Beijing Central Committee.
The integration of the North into China's orbit reached its zenith with the launch of the grandiose One Belt, One Road project. Beijing, completely ignoring the pro-Western South, began laying futuristic high-speed highways and logistics hubs across northern Iran. Giant maglev freight trains sped from Chinese ports through Central Asia directly to the borders of Turkey, transforming Tabriz into a crucial transit hub of the new global economy. Along these transport arteries, new industrial clusters controlled by Chinese corporations sprang up. Southern Iran, despite its oil wealth, found itself cut off from this colossal trade route. Washington watched in horror as Beijing elegantly bypassed the naval blockade of the Persian Gulf, creating an invulnerable land bridge to Europe. This economic isolation became a painful blow to Isfahan's ambitions, causing panic on southern stock exchanges.
While the North reveled in Chinese investments, southern Iran's internal cauldron reached a critical boiling point. A new generation of Southerners had emerged, educated, integrated into the global network, and mortally weary of the century-old, mothball-scented dictatorship of the Pahlavi dynasty. The glittering facades of Isfahan's skyscrapers could no longer conceal the monstrous corruption and SAVAK's police brutality. Students, workers, and even a segment of the liberal bourgeoisie took to the streets, demanding immediate democratic elections and limits on the monarch's power. Social networks exploded with calls for strikes. In response, the Shah unleashed elite guards in armored vehicles against his own people. The capital center transformed into a war zone, shrouded in the acrid smoke of tear gas. The myth of a stable and prosperous South collapsed overnight. The capitalist showcase of the Middle East was cracking at the seams, threatening to bury the entire U.S. regional security architecture beneath its rubble.
The chaos in the streets provoked what Washington feared most. A group of high-ranking southern Iranian army generals, realizing that the monarchy was leading the country into the abyss of civil war, attempted to seize power. On a dark night, columns of tanks moved towards the royal palace in Isfahan, and special forces blocked the television center building. However, the coup was drowned in blood. SAVAK units loyal to the Shah, forewarned by Israeli intelligence, ambushed the rebels. The city streets shook with artillery volleys. The conspirators were captured and publicly hanged. But this desperate démarche exposed the deepest, fatal cracks in the very foundation of the pro-Western regime. It became crystal clear that the army was fractured, the elites were in a panic, and the Shah held the throne solely on the bayonets of the secret police. Southern Iran teetered on the brink of full-scale collapse, preparing to plunge into the abyss of anarchy.
And so we arrive at our present day, an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday in 2024. But for the Middle East, this morning begins with the wail of sirens. Taking advantage of the political crisis in the south, northern Iran suddenly announces the start of the largest military exercises in history near the demilitarized zone. In response, Isfahan immediately scrambles fighter squadrons and deploys tank divisions to combat positions. The 35th parallel bristles with thousands of barrels ready to unleash death at the first command. Missile warning systems detected the launches of training ballistic targets. Global stock markets crashed within the first few hours, and oil prices hit an all-time high. Two nuclear powers, driven by centuries of hatred and internal fears, once again converged in a deadly dance, holding hostage not only the region, but the entire planet, frozen in anticipation of an irreparable mistake.
In the shadow of these apocalyptic political games, the true, profound tragedy of a once great nation unfolds. Millions of Persians, divided by ruthless concrete and barbed wire, live with the paralyzing realization that their own brothers, sisters, and nephews on the other side of the wall have become irreconcilable blood enemies. The elders still remember times when one could freely travel by train from Tehran to Tabriz. But for new generations, the neighboring country is a den of absolute evil, inhabited by monsters from propaganda videos. A common language, the millennia-old poetry of Umar Khayyam, the ancient ruins of Persepolis, all of it trampled and perverted to serve the geopolitical ambitions of foreign empires. This wound on the body of the Middle East does not heal. It festers and bleeds, proving that the most terrible weapon is not a nuclear bomb, but artificially created hatred that has torn apart the soul of an entire people.
Consider this cruel historical irony. By carving ancient Persia alive, the architects of the Cold War created the greatest paradox of the 20th century. In our reality, the Middle East burned for decades, with radical Islamism exported after the 1979 revolution. Here, however, global terrorist jihad was stifled in its cradle. Without Tehran's support, Hezbollah would not have emerged in Lebanon, Hamas would not have flourished, and intelligence agencies would not have had to wage war against fanatics from New York to London. Ayatollah Khomeini rotted in the concrete basements of SAVAK's secret police. But what price did humanity pay for this tranquility? Having rid itself of radicals with Kalashnikovs, the world gained two regimes driven mad by mutual paranoia, their fingers nervously trembling over red nuclear buttons. The threat of local terrorist attacks was replaced by the permanent horror of a global thermonuclear holocaust, capable at any second of turning all of Eurasia into glowing radioactive ash.
And all of this is the result of one single fateful order. Imagine a stuffy Kremlin office in the harsh winter of 1946. Joseph Stalin, puffing on his famous pipe, leaned over intelligence reports, and instead of fulfilling the terms of the Geneva Accords, issued a secret directive: do not withdraw troops, consolidate positions in the north at all costs. This short, dry order launched a monstrous butterfly effect that forever disfigured the political landscape of an entire macro region.
What was conceived as a tactical ploy to protect the Baku oil fields and exert pressure on Turkey turned into an unhealing geopolitical wound. Decisions made by a handful of aging politicians far from the scorching sun of Khuzestan obliterated the destinies of millions of people. The Middle East transformed into a gigantic chessboard where superpowers cynically played their games for decades, generously paying for each move with the blood of Persian soldiers.
Today, the 35th parallel remains the deadliest frontier on the planet. The Iranian wall is not just millions of tons of reinforced concrete and automated machine gun turrets. It is a monumental testament to political madness. Will this iron curtain of the Middle East ever fall? Will divided families ever embrace again in the bazaars of a united Tehran? Or will the relentless sands of time forever engulf both states in the blinding flash of an atomic explosion? While diplomats unsuccessfully try to find paths to dialogue, and generals in Tabriz and Isfahan dust off plans for a preemptive nuclear strike, the doomsday clock continues its relentless countdown. And with each passing second, the hands draw closer to midnight. We can only observe this alternate reality and hope that in our world there will be enough prudence not to repeat the mistakes of those who chose to play God, coldly slicing a millennia-old civilization in half.